Hi there, curious people. It's great to have you with me again for a new episode of Curious People Wanted, a series by the Barnum Museum in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I'm Adrienne St. Pierre, and I am the curator of the museum's collection. It may surprise some of you that our museum not only has historical artifacts and documents, we also have artwork. Today, we're going to take a closer look at two paintings in the collection, both by the same artist, Frederick R. Spencer, who was a native of upstate New York and worked in those cities as well as New York City. These paintings date to about the same year or very close, and they are portraits of P.T. Barnum's immediate family members, his wife and their daughters. And I thought I'd share a few observations about these paintings that you might not know by looking at them alone. First, some background. These were painted in 1847, which is when P.T. and his wife Charity were in the process of building their extraordinary mansion Iranistan, the first of 4 homes they would build in Bridgeport. So in having these portraits made, they were planning ahead, thinking about what would grace the interior of their grand new home. Keep in mind that 1847 was merely 8 years into the age of photography. So paintings and drawings were no longer the only way to capture a likeness of someone. But photography was new, and daguerreotype photographs made then were only the size of one's hand. Large oil portraits were still regarded as something prestigious that served both to signal a family's prosperity as well as preserving appearances. Certainly, a really large, full-length portrait like this was something that commanded attention. Interestingly, around the time of The Greatest Showman movie with Hugh Jackman, our portrait of the Barnum daughters was one of the most frequently viewed items in our online digital collection. In the movie, which remember was a musical, not a documentary, Barnum and his wife Charity had 2 daughters. So perhaps there were movie watchers curious to know more about the daughters, and maybe their Google searches led them to our painting in the Connecticut Digital Archive. We're happy for people to see it, of course, and it's a very appealing painting with rich colors and a lot to see in it. But starting with our subjects here, I should tell you the group is often mistakenly assumed to be Mrs. Barnum with her daughters. And you would certainly think that if you saw the Hugh Jackman movie and thought the Barnums had just 2 daughters. In fact, the figure in the blue dress is not Mrs. Barnum. She is Caroline, the Barnums' eldest daughter, who was born in 1833. The 2 others are their second daughter, Helen, in the pink dress, and the toddler in the middle with the curly golden hair is Pauline. Aha, you say, they really had 3 daughters. Well, sadly, the truth is they had 4. And Pauline, the toddler here, was the 4th. Sadly, the Barnums lost their 3rd daughter, Frances, in April of 1844, just shy of her 2nd birthday. To add to the tragedy, Barnum was traveling in Europe when Frances died. One can only imagine the distress he felt in losing her while being thousands of miles away, and from Charity struggling to cope with the loss. The tragedy seemed to have made him excessively fearful that Helen, who was just 4 years old at the time, might perish if she caught cold. Barnum's letters reveal that he was petrified that her frequent sore throats might lead to a fatal illness. Well, fortunately, Helen survived childhood. In fact, all 3 of the girls lived into adulthood and had children of their own. So, how old are the girls here? Well, we know the date of the painting, 1847, as the artist recorded it right here on this red book along with his signature. Little Pauline was born on March 1st, 1846, and it looks to me as if she is over a year old, maybe a year and a half, when this was painted. If that guess is correct, then Helen would be about 7 and a half, and Caroline would be 14 and a half. The reason Caroline is often mistaken for the mother of 2 girls is that her clothing, accessories, and hairstyle signal a more grown-up appearance. I would have guessed she was about 16, the age when girls generally transition to wearing full-length dresses and putting their hair up. Caroline is also wearing prominent jewelry, this gold bracelet and a fine lace collar. These are not accessories for a young girl. So how to account for this? I can't say for certain, but one theory is that because Caroline was attending a boarding school in Washington, D.C., and she started there in the fall of 1845, her transition to a grown-up appearance was maybe a little more accelerated in that environment, being in the nation's capital. Helen's dress is identical to her sister's in the cut and the details, such as the pleats on the sleeves and radiating from this pointed waist. But the skirt portion is much shorter, a length that is appropriate for a little girl. And her hair is worn short and loose. She is too young for jewelry, and the fine lace, although her dress does have a little trimming around the neckline. Pauline is wearing a white gown typical of what a toddler would wear, boy or girl. Let's take a look at the setting before we look at the other costume accessories. This is a made-up setting, of course, but it is not random. Everything conveys a message. Probably the thing that's caught your attention is the luxurious interior painted with an exterior view, apparently through an open door. Although a door is not well defined, we can see this is not a window that we're looking through. There's nothing that creates a barrier between the inside and outside. And that's an important choice that the artist was making, seamlessly connecting the interior and exterior. And the view is an inviting landscape with trees near and far, a lush green meadow, and a river or pond in the distance. Very lovely and romantic looking. In fact, this vision of nature aligns with the aesthetic of what's called the Romantic era. So these beautiful spaces, inside and out, complementing one another, were intended to show that the girls were participants in such bucolic natural surroundings, emphasizing the wholesomeness and innocence of children and their innate harmony with nature. This is an idea that was very popular at the time. In essence, the Romantic movement was a reaction to industrialization and the perception of its harmful effects on society. So Romanticism was about a return to the pureness of nature. Well, how does the artist connect the girls with the outdoors aside from the view? Through props. We see Helen and Caroline's straw bonnets laid aside as if they had just come in. You can see the edge of Caroline's bonnet at the left here and her fine shawl. And Helen seems to have worn a little short silk cape rather than a shawl. It's folded up in a little pile on the floor along with her bonnet. And there is the basket of flowers offered to Pauline, meant to look like they were just picked from a meadow. These are pretty accessories, but they also play an important role in the portrait, conveying this larger idea of nature and the pureness of youth. Another thing to notice is that the portrait is, for its time, a kind of a snapshot image. Most portraits were quite formal, but here we see a degree of casualness in the sense that the portrait captures a specific moment in time, like the two older girls had just come inside the house and put their things down. I have a feeling that Barnum, hopefully Charity too, would really have liked that about this portrait. So what about the interior setting? The luxurious velvet settee and the patterned carpeting, the drapery and tassel, these all speak to the family's wealth. Now, was Frederick Spencer painting actual furnishings that the Barnums owned? My guess is that he was not, although there certainly may have been communication about what the overall look of the furnishings would be. One reason I say this is because the portrait was being painted while Iranistan was under construction. So in reality, the Barnums would not yet have had interior decor in place, and they were living in a rented home prior to moving into Iranistan. Still, they would certainly have wanted the portrait to appear to advantage in their new home. So I expect those rich colors and patterns, the deep red velvet, and the upholstery trimmings would have been chosen with that goal in mind. This is a charming depiction of the Barnum girls and a portrait that can be easily enjoyed by people today. It doesn't have the kind of darkness and formality that many early portraits do. Now, let's take a look at Charity Barnum's portrait, also by Frederick Spencer. Charity would have been in her late 30s, say 38 or 39 when this was painted. It is more formal, and yes, there is a lot of darkness. Her velvet dress is black or a very dark color, and the background is mainly dark. But the radiance of her complexion, her gentle smile, and the gray eyes and her glossy brown hair do make her seem like a real and friendly person. It's not an austere portrait. It's a very flattering portrait of her, a romantic portrait. Charity has her fine lace collar and lace-trimmed handkerchief, and the lace that goes over the top of her head is called a Lapet. Lapets were actually a fashion of the 1700s in Europe, and they continued to be worn on and off into the 1800s. For middle-class women in America, they were really a fashion of the 1840s and 50s, and they were usually contrived with ribbon trimmings, as you see here, the pink ribbon in this painting. It was customary for a married woman to wear a white cap or head covering like this, even indoors, and that custom lasted to about the 1860s. So these lappets were part of that tradition of women wearing a covering on their head, though lappets were really more decorative than practical that way. Having the side hair curled into ringlets was a fashion of the 1840s. This wasn't necessarily the wearer's own hair, however. Ringlets could be purchased, and I imagine that would have been an easier way for many women to adopt that style. Now let's take a look for a moment at this oval brooch that Charity is wearing. It's rather showy, and it depicts a colorful bird, although not one that I could identify. It's surrounded by jewels, and it's quite pretty. Now keep this in mind because we're going to see this again. Charity was conservative in her tastes, and she apparently hung on to the styles that were fashionable in her younger days. She wasn't a fashion maven. How do I know? Well, we have a couple of later photographs of her from the early 1870s when she was in her 60s. These photographs were taken about 25 years after the oil portrait was made. And we see that she continued to wear her hair in that ringlet style with a white cap. This one covering more of her head than the lappets. Certainly, this would have been considered a really old-fashioned look then, quite out of date. But Charity felt it suited her, and there may have been another factor. For example, possibly disguising thinning hair. We don't know if that's the case, but she did suffer chronic poor health for the majority of her adult life, and I would say she had aged beyond her years in these photos. We can't see a lot of her gown in these two photos, but in this one, it looks like her nod to fashion was the crossed over fichu, while the dress itself appears quite plain. That would be in contrast to the fashions of the late 1860s and early 70s when gowns were becoming really complex and ornately trimmed. This was largely because sewing machines were in common use. The other photo of Charity shows her in a gown with some velvet trimming at the front, which is a little more of a nod to fashion. But again, this is nowhere near as fancy as what most women were wearing in the early 1870s. So Charity clearly exercised restraint in adopting new fashions. But I do find that one of these carryovers from her younger days is quite sweet, and that is the oval brooch with the bird. We saw it in full color in the portrait painting, and here again, it appears in both of these photographs. That suggests to me that this brooch meant a lot to her. Maybe it had a lot of sentimental value. Perhaps PT purchased it for her. At least we know it must have been a favorite piece of jewelry for it to have appeared in two photos and an oil portrait. And I wish I could show you the actual brooch, but we do not have it, and I do not know if it still exists somewhere. Despite that, I think of this as a clue, offering us a little insight onto Charity Barnum and I hope you find that intriguing too. So we've had a good look at the women in P.T. Barnum's life here, but what about the man himself? Didn't he too have his portrait painted at this time? The answer is yes. There is a companion portrait to Charity's, but the Barnum Museum does not own it. The portrait of P.T. Barnum by Frederick Spencer is in the Circus World Museum in Baraboo, Wisconsin. We have this print image of it that was made years ago, and as you can see then, it showed a lot of paint loss. But Circus World had it conserved in 2015, and Mr. Barnum is back to his old, well, young self again. Thanks for taking a look at the Barnum family portraits with me today. Do stay curious, and I will look forward to welcoming you back to another episode of Curious People Wanted. Take care.